Hey, so today's video is going to be a bit different. I want to talk about how the principles we learned teaching you apply to real life work. We keep saying that what you learn here in the beginning section is what you will be using every day in your animation career, but nothing explains it better than looking at some actual examples and analyzing them. We've done a bunch of exercises and learned a lot of animation principles already, but they all relate back to the bouncing ball and the seaweed exercise in one way or another. This is because, as the title suggests, pretty much everything is a bouncing ball or a seaweed. Of course, it's not meant in a literal sense, but you've learned about timing, spacing, squash and stretch, drag, overlap, loss of momentum, arcs, overshoot, and settle can be found absolutely everywhere, as you'll see in a moment. So here I'm going to show you an example from the animated epic Maya and the Three. This series was made entirely in Blender, and fun fact, all of us who started to animate, me, Simona, and Vlad, have worked on this show. It was actually in the top 10 on Netflix when it came out for about a week until Arcane came out and threw it out of the top 10. But I'm not upset. Arcane was really good. Okay, a little upset. But anyways, so here, the main parts of the body, as you can see, are the hips, the chest, and the head. And they can be broken down into spheres that move with their own timing and rhythm, while also being connected and affecting each other. Most often, movements come from the hip and then travel up to the chest, which then affects how the head reacts, but they can also have a certain amount of independence, especially the head, which can rotate up, down, and side to side. Here you can even see the head dragging way behind and stretching and increasing its distance from the chest for that 1 to 2 frames to kind of sell the fact that he's falling down really fast. And if you pay attention to the balls themselves, you can see that they bounce up and then hover like we've been doing with our ball animations, and then stretch and speed up and start hitting towards the ground. So let's watch this in real time one more time. And another fun fact, this right here is actually my shot, the second part. Now, depending on the situation, the arms and the legs move more like a seaweed, with overlap happening down the joints. Again, if you go frame by frame here, you can see that the exact things we were learning with the seaweed exercise. You can see the screen right arm on Rico is dragging up at a speed, and so we got a C curve. And then once it starts changing directions, you can see it turns to an S curve, and then a sharper S curve, and then it starts going in the other direction, and again it turns to a C curve. And the same is true with the other arm. When it's traveling up in one direction, here is switching direction, so S, traveling up really fast, a C curve, switching direction, S curve, and then so on. So again, the ball exercises and the seaweed exercises that we've been covering are all coming into effect in this shot. Let's go ahead and play this for you. Using simple shapes to figure out what your animation should look like can be a great way to simplify your workflow and nail down the timing and the characters' positions in 3D without having to deal with complicated characters from the get-go. This is especially true when doing quadruped animation, which is known to be very challenging because you're dealing with 4 legs instead of 2. In reality, you don't really need to worry about the legs because you have to figure out what the body is doing first. Figure out the body motion, and since that's the most important part, and here we can see the animator who did this shot. Let's go from the beginning. The animator who did this shot for the short feast did exactly that, blocking out their animation first, simple spheres to get the feeling for the motion, and he also included some sketches for more detail, all before even touching CG characters. I actually made a video about this on my channel as well, where when I animated this shot, I used the same technique. I used a sphere to figure out the character's movement, and then I went ahead and started animating the character inside of the sphere, mimicking the sphere's movement, because that was so much easier for me to do. So again, this is what we're teaching you here in the very basics of basics, and it's coming into effect when we're tackling very complex shots. It all comes down to the basics. And that's why we're making such an effort to make this very basics section of the animation course as comprehensive as possible. I also found this really interesting progress breakdown by Daniel Fotheringham, who hides the legs on the character and animates the body first. Once you have the body motion nailed, the leg animation kind of falls into place based on the speed and the position of the body. So now, let's look at some amazing animations and see how the animators applied the principles you already know. So here's an animation from Turning Red, and that's the animation. Now let me turn on the drawings. It looks very complicated, but once we turn on the drawings, you can see that it can be broken down into a couple of steps. So here we're separating the animation into 3 sections: the tail, the hips, and the head. The hips and the head are going to be our spheres, and the tail is going to be our seaweed. Now if you pay attention, you can see that the hips, the white ball here, is essentially just a bouncing ball traveling along a surface, traveling around an obstacle, which we've already done. So you should already have experience with that. So you can see it bounces, it even has antics where it squashes down and then stretches and lands on another obstacle, and again squashing down and stretching for another jump. Again, you can see where there's a clear squash and stretch by following the head and the hip. When the head gets closer to the hip, for example here, we have this antic right before the jump. The head is coming closer to the hip, and so the character is squashing down. And then when the character jumps, you can see the head goes farther away from the hips, creating a stretch. And then once the character lands, again, head gets closer to the hip, squash, stretch, and then that's the end of the animation. So far, we've seen the bouncing ball, we've seen squash and stretch, and the entire body motion could be broken down into those 2 things here. Lastly, we have the seaweed tail that reacts to the body motion. So here you would animate the body first, and then depending on what the body is doing, you can see that the tail is falling behind at a delay. Just a slight 1 to 2 frame delay here. We have a C curve, and then once the tail starts changing directions because the body is going in the other direction, the tail goes from the C curve that we were talking about before into an S curve and then a reverse C curve. So these are all lessons that you've already learned and exercises you've already done. It's just all put together and very nicely done. Now the thing that tops us off, that makes this really work, is the fun, dynamic timing of the whole shot by making some bounces smaller and faster and other ones longer and slower. So for this example, let me play it first. This is what we have to work with. You can already see where this is headed. So let me go ahead and turn on the drawings. So here the hips are doing a bouncing ball, obviously. And as you can see, the spacing is bigger when they're traveling down, just like the V shape on the graph editor when we're doing a bouncing ball. So here, let's track the green ball here, the green sphere, the hips. So the spacing here is it's hovering, and then it's quickly traveling down within 2 frames, is on the ground for 1 frame, and then starts making its way up. And again, in 2 frames, it's up in the air. Now the spacing is slower, and so for about 5 frames, it's traveling on top of this arc, and again, bouncing down and creating that V shape that we love creating when we're doing our bouncing balls. So now if we look at Tigger's head, the red sphere here, you can see that on impact, so once it's about to start traveling back up and it's changing direction, we get a squash on his face where his eyes close and his mouth close, and this is again to show a squash. And as he starts traveling up, his head starts rotating down. And as he's falling down, his head starts rotating up, and then on impact again, his mouth closes, his eyes closes to convey squash. And as he starts traveling back up, his head starts rotating down again to create drag. So here again, we have drag and squash. So you can create these things depending on what your character is. You have to find creative ways sometimes to show squash. Like in this case, we have the compression of the face. And that's how the animator is showing squash on Tigger's head. Now the squash on the body, however, you can see by the skin wrinkling up. So here the skin is wrinkling up, and then when he stretches, it's not wrinkled anymore. And then it starts getting wrinkled up again, and then on the stretch, it's not wrinkled anymore. So again, creative ways of showing squash and stretch and showing drag. And we're not even going to talk about the tail anymore because you know it's there. You know the seaweed's there. Now the second clip, as you can see, it is literally just a bouncing ball exercise. So I'm going to go ahead and press play here. Bounce, 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 bounce. The hips are just creating a bouncing ball. Just like our exercise where the ball was bouncing from left to right. Here the ball is bouncing from right to left. So not much difference. That's the hip. But what we have is we have an offset where the chest kind of travels 1 to 2 frames after the hip. And the biggest offset of all is the head and the chest. If you pay attention, the chest leads the action. So the chest moves down. Here, let's say, the chest is all the way down, but the head is dragging behind. The head is staying in a similar position, only slightly down. And it's creating this stretch effect on the tiger's neck. And if we go a couple frames more forward, now the head is caught up. So before the chest was going down, and now that the chest is going up, the head is coming down. So it's kind of doing the opposite of the head because it's delayed and because it's dragging behind. So if we go more forward, now it's starting to go up with the chest again. And the chest starts going down this way, and the head is continuing to travel up until we reach this point, which is like the maximum stretch, where the chest is changing directions and going up, and that's when the head is finally starting to come down. So there's an offset. So the chest is going down, the head is kind of like staying in place, and once the chest is going up, the head starts coming down. And again, if you take a look at the tail, we have this seaweed motion. So we have the C curve here, and as it's changing direction, it turns into an S curve, and then a reverse C curve, and so on. It's just following the body's movement, and it's just doing this movement basically. And the in-between of this C curve and the reverse C curve that it's creating is of course the S curve or the reverse S curve. And it's just cycling between those 4 poses basically. So again, everything comes down to a bouncing ball and a seaweed motion. So here I'm going to turn off the drawings again, and let's take a look at this clip from The Lion King. So here, Simba's whole body is like one big bouncing ball. Let me turn on the drawings here. So as you can see, from frame 1 to 6, you can see the arc of the bouncing ball starting, and then he plummets down, and then launches up here, and he actually overshoots because he had built so much momentum from that jump, from that fall, where now he's overshooting instead of stopping. He's launching up into the air, and then he lands, which is a lot more dynamic and a lot more fun. So if he just slid down and then here he just stopped instead of overshooting from that momentum, then it wouldn't be as fun, and you'd feel like there'd be a loss of energy there because he was traveling down so fast. So it's always good to think about what your character is doing and how the physics apply and how you can make the most fun out of the shot with what you have. Now here, once Simba lands, we have a squash position. So you can see him kind of like spreading out here, but once he's on the impact frame, his body squashes down and then stretches out afterwards. Also around frame 38, you can see that the tail, so Simba's spinning here, right? He's spinning in the air and the tail is wrapping around him and then opens up afterwards. This is exactly like our exercise where we put all the animation together. Our ball here, when the ball is spinning, pay attention again, when the ball is spinning, the tail is wrapping around our ball just like it did with Simba in that animation. So again, we're teaching you guys the very basics with a ball and a tail, but really what you're learning here can be applied to the most advanced animations. Now, time for a scene from my favorite and most hated animation series. No, I'm kidding. I love this animation series, Arcane. This whole scene is essentially just a bouncing ball. Let's take a closer look. So looking at the main character here, this guy, which, spoiler, it may or may not be Echo. Here around frame 11, we can see that he stretches down as the ball is coming down. He stretches and then squashes around here. And as he's about to land, he stretches again and then squashes down. So it's just squash, stretch, squash, stretch, squash. And if we were to follow him, I can't even turn on maybe Ghost here. So if you were to follow him, you can see that he's essentially just creating a bouncing ball animation. And so if you play this, you can see it just creates this kind of motion coming towards a bouncy ball coming towards the camera. And in general, the arm and the coat drag behind. Now there's a lot of other stuff in effect here that make this animation work and look really good, like the arm, the poses they chose. Now we're not going to get into it in the beginner section, but the posing on the arms here are amazing. But overall, the arms and the coats are kind of dragging behind with the hip and with the rest of the body. It's a complex scene, but these are the things that make it work so well. It's all about the timing and the spacing of the entire body, or the hips first. You figure out the motion, and then you start adding other things like posing on the arms and secondary action and drag. All that stuff adds to the main motion, which is what make it feel good, which is that bouncing ball. Now, if he was traveling at the same speed the whole time, there was no squash and stretch, and there wasn't good spacing. If it was just, you know, doing the same action that he's doing now, but without him speeding up here and then hovering and then speeding up, it would look very dull and it wouldn't look as good as it looks right now. So these were mostly bouncing ball examples, but we also saw how tails react. But let's look at some more overshoot and settle examples as well. So here, let me actually turn on the drawings. The tail doesn't have a life of its own, and it's super bendy, so there's a lot of C and S curves all throughout. Here we have the ostrich stopping abruptly, so you can see the tail starting to overshoot. And it makes its way to the right, completely overshooting past its original point, and then starting to settle. And once the ostrich starts running again, you can see that it takes a couple of frames for the tail to start catching up to the motion. So this whole time it's reacting to what happens to the base, and well, the base is following Simba, and Simba is attached to this ostrich, and so essentially what's happening is the tail is completely affected by what the ostrich is doing. So if you follow the ostrich's movement here, abrupt stop, tail kind of just folding on itself and then overshooting because it was going in that direction. And then once the ostrich starts running again, the tail starts dragging behind the ostrich's movement. Again, this is an exercise we worked on, the overshoot and settle. So the same thing is happening here. When the ball stops, the tail overshoots and then comes to a settle afterwards because there's no more motion. But it had the momentum it had built up from its previous motions. So a very similar exercise to what we just witnessed. So here we're taking a look at another shot from Arcane. I don't remember the character's name. I want to say Marcus, but I'm not sure. But we're basically just looking at this foreground character. And if you notice, we only see the character from the collarbone up, but you can feel the character taking a step. Even though you don't see the rest of his body, you can feel the step being taken. And that's just the mechanics just being so well done. Now the halfway point, we can see the body swinging right, and you can see a slight dragging on the head. So as the body is going this direction, you can see the head is slightly tilted and is dragging behind just very slightly. So again, this is drag. And then another thing we noticed is once the character goes all the way to the right, you can see that the character overshoots actually and starts moving back a little bit and settling back. And so what we have is we have drag on the head, and then we have overshoot, and then we have a settle. Now adding an overshoot and a settle is a great way to bring a fast movement to a stop. Otherwise, if there was no overshoot or settle and the character just swung right and then let's say they just stopped right there, they didn't continue to settle afterwards, making it an overshoot, it would look like the character just hit a wall. And this is a very common mistake that beginner animators make. A lot of times when a beginner animator starts animating a character and the character is moving really fast or is going in a direction, what they'll do, they'll just stop the action. It's like, okay, the character went from here, let's say, to here, and then they stop. And what that looks like is that it looks like the character hit an invisible wall, this wall right here, which shouldn't exist. If we learn anything from these ball animations, these overshoots and settles that we've been doing with the ball animations, if you apply that to your character animation, the character should overshoot and then settle back into this position. This one is very important and I want you guys to remember it because again, it's a very common problem and it's a very common mistake that beginner animators make. Don't just stop a fast action by hitting that last pose. Hit with an overshoot and then settle back into the pose that you want them to stop in. Now this example here is from Kiki's delivery service, and what we're looking at is the radio here. So here the radio is swinging side to side because it's hung from the broom, but when we pay attention, when the broom starts going right here, you can see that the radio is dragging behind, very much like our tail exercise. But you can see that here, it actually swings forward and catches up, but then once the broom starts traveling to the right faster, it starts going into a drag again. And so it drags, it catches up, and then it drags again. And it's not a smooth motion where it's just dragging. It's not just a sideways smooth motion because Kiki, this character right here, is learning how to fly, and this little animation we have with the radio is actually a really good way to add texture and storytelling to the animation. Kiki is learning how to fly, and so her movement is really jaggedy with the broom, and it's not a straight motion, and you can tell that just by the radio as well. So we're back again with Lion King, and here, as you can see, we have a simple seaweed motion on the feathers, just like we learned in the overlapping action, ball with tail, this exercise. So we have the same thing happening with the feathers as we practiced with this exercise. You can also notice that the seaweed motion is also applied a bit to Simba and Nala's tails, but also a little bit of overlapping action and seaweed motion happening with the ears as well. And you can also see some squash and stretch happening with Simba and Nala's face with this bouncing ball action. Alright, we're almost done with the examples. We have this one, then another one, and then we're done. This one is from Paperman. This is a short by Disney from I think 2012, but let's take a look first. So the seaweed is almost always present when you have stuff blowing in the wind. In this case, it's the hair and also the paper that this character is holding. You can notice the difference where the paper is a lot more bendy and the hair is a lot more stiff. It tells you something about the properties of the objects that you're animating. So yes, they're both seaweed animations, but they're done differently and done at different speeds and are bending in different ways. So just because it's seaweed, it doesn't mean it's animated in the exact same way. You know, when we talked about when animating a tennis ball and a bowling ball falling off a shelf, just because two objects are performing the same motion, it doesn't mean that the motion will be identical. So always think about what the objects that you're animating are made of. Again, in this case, the paper is very thin and long, so it gets affected by the wind a lot more aggressively, but the hair is shorter and in clumps. He should probably wash his hair, which means it doesn't move as much as the paper. Okay, our last example here. You can observe the same thing in this clip from Kiki's delivery service. Some of the leaves are more stiff and the grass is more bendy. The hair moves more than the paper man's hair because the hair clumps are thinner and the hair is longer. And that's all I have for you for today. I hope this lesson was an eye-opening one and maybe even gave you motivation to keep learning. You already know much of the foundations that go into creating an animated shot. Now you just need to practice them. I recommend doing this on your own too. Just grab any of your favorite animations and just analyze it. Go frame by frame and take a look at how the animation was done. You can learn so much just by doing that. So go have fun and feel free to share what you discovered with the rest of us on Circle. Happy animating, and I'll see you in the next video.